Of NAGARA, good afternoon, happy Thursday, and welcome to NAGARA's inaugural Sponsor Solution Series presentation presented by Creekside Digital. My name is Johnny Hadlock. I'm the Executive Director of NAGARA. As many of you know, NAGARA has been offering professional development webinars for years, since 2016. Now, to date, we have archived over 90 webinar presentations. That's not even including the additional 60 online forum session presentations, which anyone can go and access if they're a member of NAGARA in the archive. Our webinars are curated by our online training subcommittee. The content of those presentations is largely presented by members and practitioners. With this Sponsor Solution series, we're going to provide a dedicated space for NAGARA's corporate sponsors themselves to both curate and present the content. These new offerings will be held monthly. They will remain free to anybody, regardless of membership status. They'll provide another opportunity for you in the comfort of your own home or office to learn about what's going on with our corporate sponsors, as well as the industry things that they are leading in, the technologies that they're working on, and to glean more information about these organizations and companies. So you can learn more about the Sponsor Solution series, this new introductory offering, on our website. You can see what's coming up, all on the NAGARA events page. Before we get into today's presentation, I have two brief housekeeping items and two brief announcements. Number one, today's presentation is going to be recorded, as you know, and we're going to put this recording on Creekside Digital's company profile page on the website. Easy to find, and after this presentation, once the video is there, I'll send you all an email straight to the company profile page where you can see it. Second, there's going to be a question and answer session at the end. If you have a question, type that into the chat box, and we'll get to that towards the end. Now, Jim's presenting today, so if he decides to see he sees a question and decides to answer it live and in real time, he has the option to do that. It's his presentation. That's the housekeeping items. By way of announcements, one, we are thrilled that annual conference registration has opened just a couple days ago, this past Monday. We invite all of you to learn more at nagara.org/annual conference. Here's the top line, what you need to know. The conference is in July. Great information on the website, Cincinnati, Ohio, and it will be our largest program to date with over 30 concurrent session offerings, 2 evening receptions, a stacked vendor hall, networking and connection opportunities, 2 breakfast buffets, 2 lunch buffets, continental breakfast. I mean, we do it well. If you have been to one of our shows before, you'll want to come again. We invite all of you to learn more, nagara.org/annual conference. And the last announcement today is that by the end of this month, March 31st, your applications for NAGARA's annual awards program are due. So please visit the NAGARA homepage. Right there, you will see a picture, Annual Awards Program. Click that link for more information. This is the time to celebrate the accomplishments and achievements of our colleagues and friends. So we hope that if you know of a project or a person that has excelled in the industry, in the field, in the community, please go nominate them for award. They deserve recognition. This is an excellent profession, and each of you deserve to be seen and acknowledged. And now, with those out of the way, I'm excited to introduce our webinar, I'm so used to saying that. I'm excited to introduce our Sponsor Solution Series presenter to you, Jim Studnicki. Jim is the founder and president of Creekside Digital, a service bureau located in beautiful Glen Arm, Maryland, just down the street from us here. Creekside Digital employs over 30 full-time skilled technicians, photographers, and software professionals, operates the largest facility in the United States dedicated to standards compliant, measurably accurate still image digitization, and counts some of the nation's most prestigious cultural institutions as core customers. Jim is focused on continually refining the company's workflows to gain efficiencies and drive down costs while increasing measurable quality, as well as developing new and innovative solutions to help Creekside's customers achieve compliance or higher levels of FADG and NARA OMB M1921 for permanent records. He's an open source and open access advocate, holds an MS in Information Systems from the University of South Florida in Tampa. Jim, thank you for being the guinea pig for our inaugural Sponsor Solution Series presentation. The rest of the time is yours, my friend. Please take it away.
Thank you, Johnny. And I'm kind of used to being the guy that runs up the hill with the flag every once in a while, so not a problem. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. And when I
Quickly, did you
approach
want to share your
a
slides? Don't mean to interrupt. Did you want to share your
I
screen?
haven't started yet. That's probably a good idea. Let's go ahead and share the slides now. Before I start talking and then forget to do it.
I'll mute myself so I don't interrupt you again. My apologies.
Okay, looks like I am the presenter now, and let us full screen with the title slide then. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So, when I approach one of these presentations, the very last thing in the world that I want to do is have somebody talk at me for 45 minutes or an hour and really just tell me what they're selling. I choose to approach these in what I hope is a much more valuable and inherently interesting way, and it is how can we assist your agency or your institution, in this case, your archive, to accomplish some of its goals. In this forum, obviously, and I think Johnny alluded to this very well, intrinsically, hopefully you learn something about these types of services and in general about this industry, for lack of a better term, this archival community and this particular aspect of it, because this solution footprint is very unique, it's very specialized, and some of the things that we're doing are inherently newer. They've not been done before because there's never been a need to do it in this way and at this scale until now, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So let me talk about who I am. Let's talk about who the company is a little bit. Our company is Creekside Digital. We are based in Glen Arm, Maryland, and that is a very beautiful place about 55 miles from Capitol Hill. We're out in Baltimore County, and that's actually an old glass plate negative of the very building in which we are located today. We're in the back. We have a 16,000 square foot facility that has been built out very specifically to do this type of work. And we only do one thing at Creekside Digital. We are specialists. We specialize exclusively in creating and verifying standards compliant still image assets. And specifically, those assets comply mostly with two types of guidelines, either the FADGI guidelines, and that's FADGI stands for Federal Agency Digital Guideline Initiative. We're going to talk about that today in a little bit. And then more recently, the technical guidelines under M1921, and specifically under M1921 for permanent records. So I think it's very important to mention a couple of things here, because you see M1921 thrown all over the place now. It's on everybody's websites and that sort of thing. We don't do anything related to M1921 for database conversion or born digital record creation or migrating emails or SharePoint sites or anything like that. There are many other qualified vendors that are working on those issues and problems, and that is not us. We cover one aspect of M1921, and that is the creation and verification of still image assets from your paper records, and specifically from your permanent paper records. Those are the class of records under M1921 that are underpinned by the FADGI guidelines. We're going to talk about this in a little bit, and specifically what that means and how we can assist your organization with that. But we've been doing this for a long time. We actually started the company in 2006. We've been doing FADGI compliant still image work since about 2013, so 10 years now. Everything we do is essentially compliant with the FADGI guidelines at essentially a 3-star level of performance. We literally have engineered our entire services footprint around delivering assets that comply with those version of the guidelines. Any type of material, essentially, I like to say anything that doesn't move or make noise, we digitize it. We're commonly asked to digitize all these record types. The big one with the archival community, of course, is paper records, box records, loose records, things that require prep, things that are ready to go, as we say, scan ready or camera ready. That's a lot of what we get in. A lot of library class materials, bound books, serials, monographs, newspapers, all types of photographic material. We still do a lot of microfilm. When I started the company back in 2006 and really started doing this full time in 2008, that was the very first thing that we scanned. We only scanned microfilm, nothing else. Microfilm scanning was new at the time. And then oddball and oversized stuff. We do a lot of map and drawing digitization. And then we get asked by big museums and other folks to art galleries to come in and digitize objects and ephemera that they might have. But again, this is all we do. Everything we do is compliant with the FADGI guidelines. We don't do anything else. We don't sell any equipment. We don't do any conservation. We don't provide any type of other archival or library services. And this allows us to be among the very best in the world because this is all we specialize in and do all day, every day. And what that means is we've figured out over the years a couple ways to scale these workflows and processes up rather dramatically, right? So when I talk about scaling, I want to talk about some of the larger projects that we have. Right now we're processing probably what's the world's largest FADGI compliant digitization project right now. It's a 26 million page, 6-year effort on site at the Library of Congress and the U.S. Copyright Office. It is contractually we have to conduct it to strict FADGI 3-star at 400 PPI. That's an increase on the base specs. Currently we are delivering over 110 master files per week. That does not include any of the derivatives that go along with them. Over the past 3+ years, we have an acceptance rate of over 99.92%. That's pretty good. We have another project that's being processed in Glen Arm for the Law Library of Congress. This is actually the United States Congressional Serial Set. This is another very, very large project. This one's a mere 12 million pages over 5 years. Again, the same specs. Strict FADGI 3 at 400 PPI. This one's actually being processed in our Glen Arm, Maryland facility. The throughput's about half that, 55,000 master files per week. And in the past 3 years, we've delivered almost 8 million pages and almost 50,000 maps and foldouts on that project with an incredibly low rejection rate as well. We're conducting these two projects in parallel with a number of other large projects that this company processes. So the reason I bring these numbers to everybody's attention is there's a lot of misconception that FADGI is hard to do. FADGI is not possible. The technology doesn't exist to do it yet. By the way, this Congressional Serial Set project is being processed. Congressional Serial Set project is being processed with cut sheet scanners, auto document feed scanners, not overhead cameras, not from bound books. This is a cut sheet project, very much like we will see processed under M1921. It's being processed with cut sheet scanners. And we were able to achieve these very strict guidelines, the same exact guidelines that underpin M1921 for permanent records, no problem. So if you hear it is currently not possible to achieve high throughput, or it's too hard, or there's no scanners that will do this, that is hogwash. That is nonsense. It is being spoken by people that have not done this before or have some other motivation to tell you that. We have been doing this at scale for a very long time now. It is possible to do this today. It is possible to achieve all of the requirements under M1921 for permanent records and for FADGI 3 and above today. That's one of the most important things I want you to take away from this presentation. If you would like to discuss digitization services with us a little bit more, if you have a potential project you would like to cost out under either M1921, or I saw that we do have a few library facing folks on the call today. That's fantastic. Of course, we'd love to talk with you as well. Please contact our Director of Digitization Services, Joan DeShiel. Her contact info is here. If you want to contact her, you can either send me an email or wait till Monday. A week from Monday. She's out on vacation next week. So I will say, if you want to talk to somebody next week, it's better to contact me over the next week because Joan is out on vacation next week. Let's talk a little bit, and hopefully FADGI is not a mystery to the people that are joining this call. I do suspect that some people are not as familiar with the FADGI guidelines. So I did want to put part of this presentation to talk about what is FADGI and why are we doing this stuff. Some of you that attended my NAGARA presentation last August with Michael Horsley from the National Archives will remember some of this content. I included some of it because I think it's fundamentally educational in terms of understanding how this stuff came to be. Like most types of guidelines and regulations, it didn't originate in a vacuum. Okay, there's a reason and a history of events as to how we got here, right? So when we first gained the ability to digitize records and books and items and films and other things like that, call it back in the 1990s. You can put argue about the specific date or, whatever that was. But, in the 90s and even early 2000s, people started asking some of these questions, and they tried to do it themselves. But even if they did it themselves, they had to answer some of these questions. If they were at a federal agency, often they would try and subcontract some of this work out to a vendor, right? That's pretty typical for some of the variety of services that our governments at all levels will procure, right? And they put out a statement of work and they sent their materials out, or the vendor came and picked them up, and they got back files, mostly files on a hard drive. These days, maybe they get them delivered via an Amazon S3 bucket or SFTP or something like that, right? But they started to dig into what they got back from the vendors, and they were like, uh-oh, this doesn't look right. There were a multitude of problems with the content that they got back. First of all, did we even have a digitization spec that adequately told the vendor what it is that we wanted back when our materials were digitized? A lot of times that was completely missing. The agency or the customer would just say, hey, scan this for us, and they got back what they got back because they didn't put any guidelines or parameters around that. If there were specifications, then the next logical question is, okay, well, vendor X sent this back to us. How'd they do? Did they adhere properly to the specification? Well, yeah, let's check through this, or, how are we going to check through this? And then they started to get into some of the underlying problems that were, prior to the advent of FADGI. Images from this batch don't look right. They have problems. They have this weird green cast on the pages where the previous batch looked more normal and accurate and faithful to the original materials. These look fuzzy. Look, they're noticeably fuzzy around the edges, and this last batch you sent me looks really sharp. Bottom line was, you could tell there was something right, but we lacked the language and consistent tools to prove or describe what we were seeing and make it actionable. And what did the vendors say when they were confronted with this? Well, some of the more scrupulous vendors said, we see that, we get it, we'll fix it for you. Others, unfortunately, were just like, break, here's the invoice, pay it. Once that happened a lot, and it happened at scale, it started to get very expensive because oftentimes the customer was stuck holding the bag with a bunch of digitized content that didn't do them any good. So they got together, and specifically I'm talking about the federal agencies that are cultural heritage facing. This is folks like the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, of course, the National Archives, and others that hold a lot of quantities of these types of materials, got together back in the mid-2000s and started talking about this stuff. And they started deciding about how they could put together a series of specs where they could use to essentially hold these vendors' feet to the fire to deliver a consistently quality service. And that is where FADGI came from. And in 2010, the first version of the FADGI guidelines was published, right? That is underpinned by real image science. That defines the things that we measure, these metrics, right? We don't have time to go into that today. I actually teach a whole series of webinars with Don Williams for lyricists. Every year we try and do that. That's a whole nother story. If you want to learn more about the metrics, that's another avenue to go down. But essentially, a lot of these things are codified today in an ISO standard, ISO 19264, and FADGI is the implementation of that ISO standard. FADGI is mostly published by the Library of Congress. They put more money into it than any other federal agency, but they leverage the quality metrics that are defined in ISO 19264, and they give you per material type different types of standards and guidelines to follow for your digitization specifications. They do this for master files, and they tell us how to measure things like color accuracy, which they call Delta E2000, and white balance and tone scale and image sharpness, or what they call SFR, or spatial frequency response. These are all the FADGI facing metrics that are defined by ISO 19264 and implemented through FADGI, right? So, most specifically, the Library of Congress and Smithsonian are two of the earliest adopters of the FADGI guidelines. And we've been working on projects with both of those agencies since 2013 or so at scale. And through this work, primarily with them, we've proven that absolutely this stuff is real, it's mature, and it's proven. What has happened more recently, the M1921 guidelines are, as many of you know, are coming to be. They were supposed to go into effect at the beginning of this year. The NARA has graciously granted an 18-month extension to all of the federal agencies who are required to adhere to M1921. So now the deadline is next July. But essentially what that means in practice is that all of these federal agencies that deposit their permanent records at the National Archives must, by next July, digitize their permanent records according to a FADGI 3-star level of compliance, and additionally some other M1921 specific requirements around things like metadata and checksums and a few other things that are left out of the FADGI guidelines themselves. So anyway, the solution, how we make all of this stuff work consistently at a high level of quality, is to define and implement these standards. And that work has been done very well, starting in 2010 and beyond. The problem is that nobody outside of the cultural heritage community has really used this until now because they haven't had to. That's why that mandate by NARA is so important. It forces the entirety of the federal government to do this because NARA is not going to accept any more paper. And if you're going to be depositing digitized permanent records, they must be compliant with FADGI 3. We hear the FADGI itself thrown around quite a bit. In practice, what does it mean, really? Well, you can see in this shot, there's an object next to that sheet of stamps that's being digitized. This is a picture from one of our early projects at Smithsonian's National Postal Museum a number of years back. Well, we're going to talk about what that little rectangular object is and why it's so important. What I want to tell everybody is that FADGI itself is not a magic word. This symbol that you see here it doesn't have any intrinsic magical powers. If you see it on a box from a scanner, from a piece of hardware that you buy from somebody, or you see it on somebody's website, this does not guarantee anything in itself. Anybody can use this. I'm using it in this presentation right now. But just saying it doesn't mean anything. FADGI has to be made actionable. And the primary way that we make FADGI actionable is through the digitization of these physical objects. You saw the example of one in that little rectangular bar. They're called targets, okay? And targets have elements on them that allow us to measure these metrics that are defined in ISO 19264. That's really what the implementation of FADGI itself is about. It is about giving us real-world actionable ways to do stuff with these measurement points. And really, if I could give you one phrase that means how we make FADGI actionable more than anything else is, we take targets, these physical real-world things, we digitize them under the same conditions that we're going to digitize our materials, and then we analyze an image of that target with special software. That measures these metrics, and it gives our imaging system a performance report of how it's doing according to the published specifications, the aim points, if you will, that define the various levels of quality, right? So first, we need targets in order to do that. There's a couple different types of these things. There's reflective targets, right? And those are physical objects that we actually bounce light off of and into our scanner or camera through a lens. There are also transmissive targets, and these are different types of targets. You can actually see through them if you put them up to the light, and you guessed it, what we do is we take a light source, we transmit light through that transmissive target, focus it with a lens, and capture it with an image sensor, and that's how we take a picture and image of a transmissive target. Targets are one part of it, and then we also need special software that can analyze the image of that physical target and tell us what those measurements are. And there's two versions of this. There's the freely available one called Open Dice that is published by the Library of Congress, And then there is the commercial version that has more bells and whistles on it called Golden Thread. All right. These are pictures of what reflective targets look like in the real world. The big guy on the left-hand side is called a device level target, right? And what it does is it actually measures, you can see it has a lot more stuff on it and it's bigger. So it's got 5 regions on it to measure uniformity, for example. So I can measure from left to right and top to bottom how uniform that target is illuminated, or how sharp is it corner to corner, right? That's why it has more stuff on it than the little guy on the right-hand side. More stuff means more points of measurement. That means it's generating more data for us to analyze. Typical actionable FADGI guidelines in practice in a statement of work will state something like, the vendor must digitize a device level target at least once per shift or daily and generate an image that passes a FADGI 3-star level of performance. If you don't have something like that language in your statement of work, guess what? It's not really FADGI compliant, and your statement of work is not really actionable. It doesn't give you the tools to enforce FADGI compliance. That type of statement has to be in there, or you're going to let your vendor off the hook, or whoever is digitizing your images for you. All right. Here are examples of transmissive targets. We use this for photographic transmissive films, right? And they come in different sizes on the left-hand side. The big guy underneath is a 4x5. He's literally the same size as a 4x5 sheet of film. We've got 2 1/4 and then a 35mm strip. The guy on the right, I think, is no longer available, although I keep begging Don Williams to make more. These are the old school microfilm targets, and these have underpinned the National Digital Newspaper Program for many years. They are falling out of favor, and we're seeing if we can have more made because they're very, very useful. But in practice, what does this look like when we measure our FADGI metrics? Well, we take target images. We just talked about how to get the targets and measure and take a picture of them. Is essentially what we're doing with our digital camera or our scanner. And then we're going to go into the measurement software. In this case, these are screenshots from the Golden Thread program. And we're going to say, okay, we're going to analyze this target at 300 pixels per inch in the Adobe RGB color space at a FADGI 3-star level of performance. That's what that highlighted test tells you, right? This is, by the way, the same specs that generally you would see under M1921. FADGI 3-star at 300 PPI is going to be the metric for most types of paper records, permanent paper records that will be processed, right? But we will select that test parameter. We will hit go, and it will say you passed or failed. Oh, bummer, we got the big red fail. More importantly than pass or fail, the program will give you actionable information about what part of the metrics are not in line with your star tier that you have chosen. So in this case, our uniformity is good, our color accuracy or delta E 2000 is good, our color registration is good, and our noise is good. But we're failing tone scale, we're failing white balance, and we're failing these resolution or spatial related metrics. So that means that there's something likely our lens is out of focus. So it gives the user immediately actionable information. And, if you do this long enough, you come up with ways on how to remedy these situations, right? So, and again, we can't go into FADGI today and what it means, but just know that these metrics are a big part of what underpins M1921. This is a big part of what our company brings to the table in terms of, when you work with us for digitization services, intrinsically understand all this stuff. We've been doing this for a long time. We've already made every conceivable mistake that can be made and figured out a lot of ways around those. So you're right out of the chute, you're starting from a very, very high level of performance and knowledge when it comes to achieving these types of beneficial results under the guidelines. Change gears now and talk about and just talking about Don Williams one more time. The targets and software that you just saw are owned and they're created and owned by a man named Don Williams. And Don is an image scientist. He is formerly at Eastman Kodak. After Eastman Kodak melted down, he went out on his own and started his own company called Image Science Associates. And he created these targets and the software, the commercial software that can be used to analyze them. And I bring Don up in this space because Don has referred to the past 10 years as the age of image literacy, right? And remember, at my first slide, I said, well, people are asking these questions about, this looks weird, something's wrong. I don't know how to describe what I'm seeing, but it doesn't look right. That is what Don Williams is talking about, the age of image literacy. When you use these targets daily in your work, you start to use also the common vocabulary that goes along with them and the measurements that are used to underpin them. And it very, very quickly, you can disseminate information to others that are doing this work, and they know what you're talking about. So that he refers to the last decade as the age of image literacy. And now we have this common language that we can use to interchange these ideas and remediate, problems very, very quickly. I refer to the next 10 years as the age of image industrialization, because we're building upon that great work. And to be clear, Creekside Digital and others like us are standing on the shoulders of giants here, that folks that came before us and did all this great work for the past 10, 15, 20 years. This is the next logical step, is to take that, scale it up massively, and automate it. And then, that's really the only way that we're able to achieve huge scale digitization, like on the US Copyright Office record books project, with such a low rejection rate. There's no other way to do it unless you industrialize. By the way, this some of you are guessing, is that Pittsburgh? Yes, it's Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This slides in there because I guess I'm kind of an industrialist. I think it's ironic because my ancestors worked in that very steel mill, the Jones and Laughlin Steel Works. My grandfather, you can see there's a bridge there. That's the hot metal bridge. During World War II, 15% of the United States domestic steel production went across that bridge. My grandfather used to walk across it every day when he was going to work, and worked in the open hearth. They made this. This is J&L Steel, a little piece of it. But I think you have to look back and where we came from. The same type of industrial processes that were used in a large steel mill, a factory, if you will, like that, are exactly the type of mindset that we need to use today when we scale up and automate this type of work. So this piece of the presentation is directed specifically at federal facing folks that are under the gun for M1921 and the deadline, and they're like, oh man, how are we going to pull this off? How are we going to be compliant? You're being asked to do something that's very challenging. And here, look, I'll just net it out for you. The size of the M1921 digitization that's going to happen is going to incredibly and massively dwarf anything, even stuff like the copyright project, that the numbers that I shared with you, that we've seen to date. It's just that much bigger. You're dealing with agencies, mostly, not all, but mostly, and a lot of vendors, almost all the vendors, have zero experience executing against the FADGI guidelines before. I can literally take one hand and count all who I would consider to be qualified vendors that have done significantly large FADGI compliant projects. I don't need all my fingers. There are very few vendors that have done this to date at these specs at scale. This is not optional work. It is required, again, for all agencies for their permanent records. They must adhere to these rigorous guidelines. The third bullet's the one that kind of weirds everybody out, right? The whole idea is NARA doesn't want this paper deposited anymore. So if you do this right and you can prove that you digitized your permanent records correctly, records literally can be destroyed. And when people in the cultural heritage community kind of wrap their brain around this, it freaks them out, and I don't blame them. What that means is you get one shot to do this correctly, and you're asking a lot of agencies that have never done anything like this before to get it right the first time. The community needs help. That's really what it comes down to. There's a multitude of challenges. I'll give the hardware vendors this: they've progressed greatly in the last couple of years. But there's still tons of work that needs to be done by the cut sheet and auto document feed scanner manufacturers. And to be clear, when we mostly talk about M1921, we're not talking about a lot of camera-based platforms or, transmissive, it's going to be mostly boxed records. That's a huge, huge, huge part of the types of paper records that are going to be digitized under M1921 for permanent. And their boxed record is going to go through a cut sheet scanner. So the hardware vendors need to step up and continue to do that. The document scanning, other vendors need to step up as well, because this is a compressed and lossy world. Most of these files traditionally have been JPEG or bitonal TIFF, and really, really, really small. This is not that world anymore. There are going to be tremendous difficulties related to the sheer size of the files that are generated from. I read reports on some of these agencies, and they literally can measure their records in linear miles. And this is one or two agencies that a single agency could have 20 or 30 linear miles of content. That's what we're talking about, the volume of this stuff. Not everybody, but a lot of them, right? The workflows are not built for the size of the files, and that needs to change, right? So the other huge hurdle, or I should say issue, that needs to be addressed through this is the liability issue. How did M1921 really, what was one of the things that the policy team at NARA was able to use to get FADGI 3 codified as the spec for permanent records? Well, there was a law case back in, I think the actual case was 2015 and 2016, called Robinson versus McDonald. And this is with the Veterans Administration. Mr. Robinson was a veteran, and he claimed benefits from the VA, and the VA said, Mr. Robinson, we're sorry, but we can't find any record of your service. Mr. Robinson said, you guys are wrong, and they still refused benefits, so he sued. And the matter went to court. That is Secretary McDonald of the Veterans Administration referenced in this case. But the judge found in favor of Mr. Robinson. After they dug in, they found that this particular agency lost Mr. Robinson's veterans file. And that is why they did not initially grant him benefits. The judge forced them to, and also was not very happy with the Veterans Administration in this matter. But I'm not trying to point any fingers at the VA. This could happen to any agency unless they take very specific steps to make sure that they are compliant under these new regulations. But the big takeaway, there's two big takeaways from Robinson versus McDonald. One is this is my underline here in this quote. You can just say this: digitized records must be treated as originals for the purpose of admissibility and evidence before the court. That underline thing is huge. That is what the policy team at NARA calls evidentiary viability. And that supports a use case of these digitized records standing in as evidence before a court of law. That is the primary use case that we will be supporting through successful digitization of these permanent records for almost all of these agencies. That's why this is so important. If you don't do this correctly, you're opening up your agency to potentially end up like the VA. Don't do it. Just a couple more slides about why this is different than anything else that's been done. There was a three-letter agency a couple of years ago that put it on an RFP, and they said they wanted to digitize 50 million images per year. And I broke down a little bit what those numbers actually mean in practice. This means we're over 4 million images per month. If I'm assuming two working shifts per day and 20 work days per month, I'm digitizing over 200,000 images per work day. I believe it's like something like 52 boxes a day or something like that. This is from one agency, from one good sized project. So, those numbers at these uncompressed, or I should say lossless master file formats generate data sizes that the document scanning industry is not used to. None of their tools are used to this. Their scanners cannot generate files that are this large rapidly enough. This is what the size of one of those 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper comes out to, if it's an uncompressed TIFF, 45 megs. Even if I knock it down and go to JP2 lossless, which is allowable under M1921, we're still talking about 18 megs for a single side of a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. This translates into about almost 4 terabytes a day of the master files only. Per month, 75 terabytes per year, almost a petabyte of data. That's for one 50 million image project for a single agency. So how's the agency going to handle all this data? How's NARA going to handle this? These are all questions that everybody should be asking. The biggest one of all that I want you all to ask today is, if you're at a federal agency, how are you going to know that your agency did this correctly? Again, if you get it wrong and you destroy those records, all kinds of bad things could happen. If you're talking about destroying permanent records, you literally have one chance to get this right. Once they're gone, they're gone. But how are you going to know? Let's say you sub this work out. If you or your vendor properly scan the records so that they're compliant with M1921 and all of the multitude of technical details that are defined under those regs for permanent records. How are you going to know if every single file in a batch, in any given batch, is compliant with M1921 or any of the other requirements that you may set up in that digitization project spec, right? The big one at the bottom is, how's NARA going to know, right? And for the agencies, that's a good thing initially, but eventually they're going to know, right? They're going to check these things. But more importantly, if you get called before a judge and your records get litigated out and you've got to support the statement that, yes, we're compliant and we did everything we could to comply with all of the technical parameters of M1921, you have to be able to prove that to a reasonable extent, right? So Creekside Digital now is, in the last couple of years, we have built up a software development team. We're making a very significant investment in this. We literally have invested a lot of money and time and resources into building solutions to answer these exact problems for all of the federal agencies and anybody else that's doing any work facing M1921 for permanent. The way that we do this is the prerequisite thing of this is, okay, well, if you're going to verify against the specification, we have to have a portable way to define what that specification is that includes all the parameters required in M1921. We call this tool Composer. Composer is essentially a web-based tool that allows us to create project specifications for your digitization projects. You define all of the parameters that your work requires and that your project requires, that your record groups may require. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a second. And it outputs a portable specification, a file, if you will, that you can then use to verify compliance of your digitized assets. You can do other things with it as well, but for today, we're going to talk about the verification piece. The file that it outputs are these DO objects. That stands for Digitization Information Object. This is a specification that Creekside Digital plans to open source later this year. We're going to publish the DO specification and make it freely available for anybody to use. We're also planning to make available this particular tool you're about to see, Composer. We're going to make this available for any institutional customer that wants to use it, any federal agency customer that wants to use it for free. They will be able to register an account and use the Composer application to generate their own specifications. The nice thing about Composer is that also, when it's available to you all, it will put out plain English statements of work that go along with these DO objects that you can put in your RFP or RFQ for these solicitations. So all of the technical specifications that underpin an M1921 compliant statement of work, they will be included. And you can just literally cut and paste them into your statement of work and off you go. What does this actually look like? Well, these are some screenshots from the Composer tool. You can see on the left-hand side, there's a navigation panel that's got 6 areas that generally categorize the parts of a digitization information object or the project specification. Of course, you have to define the master file format. This is an intelligent configurator, right? So if I specify, as I've done here for the material type, modern textual records, which is the category under the new FADGI guidelines for M1921, then my choices for that master file and all the parameters are limited by what's allowable under M1921 for permanent records. I can also change that standard to FADGI 3-star, FADGI 4-star, etc. And my master file types and choices that are available will dynamically change accordingly. So it is essentially an intelligent configurator that assists the user in generating specifications that are valid under all these standards. You don't have to memorize all this stuff. You don't have to look it up anymore. It knocks down the barrier for non-expert users wanting to get into this work and make sure that their projects are compliant with these guidelines. That is the vast majority of the users that we're going to service under M1921. They're not the experts. We're spoiled in the cultural heritage community that for so many years we've had passionate people that have dedicated years and years and years of working on this stuff. We recognize that's not going to be the case once we step out of cultural heritage for most of these agencies. So we need to build tools that will help them. And that's exactly what Composer is about. So this part of Composer sets the master file format and all of the parameters that go along with it. We also will set the type of target that you're submitting as part of your M1921 compliant batch here. You are using targets, right? Somebody asked Michael Horsley last year on our NAGARA presentation, well, are targets required or not? You have to submit them. And, Michael gave the correct answer by the book, which is no, they're not. I would follow that up, however, with a no, but. They're not required technically. But, however, if your records get litigated out and you have to stand in front of that judge and you have to prove compliance with M1921, how on earth are you going to prove compliance with all of the measurables like tone scale and SFR and Delta E2000 and white balance and uniformity if you don't have targets. You can't. Targets are the only way to prove compliance with that particular part of the M1921 regs. Ergo, it behooves you greatly to include them with your batches, right? And that's exactly what we do. We're basically for M1921 and FADG 3 and 4, we do require targets to be included in your project specification. We allow you to define where in your batch they're going to live. Another thing that's required under M1921, image metadata. So it gives you a list of metadata fields that are required. Conveniently out of the box, if you create a spec in Composer for an M1921 batch of content, it will stub in all of these required fields for you as EXIF tags. If you want to add other EXIF tags, you can look them up right from the software and plug them in. If you want, you can even see that we're setting expected values for these. So when you define your metadata, you can also define what the expected values should be for these fields. These are tied back to your master files in a lot of cases, right? I didn't mention, we didn't see it, but you can also define derivative files as part of your batch. So if you're defining a project specification that has uncompressed TIFF master file and a searchable PDF derivative for a reader file, something like that, you can absolutely define those derivatives that will live in the Composer specification, and then they can be created and verified down the road with the Virtuoso tool that I'm going to show you in a second. You can also define, but look, when we do digitization, the end result's a bunch of files on a hard drive or a server somewhere, right? That's got to look like something. And it shouldn't just be left up to the vendor or whoever's doing the work to, oh, I think I'll make them look like this today. Absolutely not. In the real world, a lot of times these naming and foldering schemas have real world meaning. They model how the physical records look like. So you might have record group, box, folder, item, typical classic archiving naming schema for a project. You can easily render that in the naming and foldering module in Composer. You could model where the M1921 administrative metadata lives. M1921 defines your administrative metadata has to live in a CSV. Where in the batch does it exist? Where should we expect to see it and verify it? All these things can be defined for you. When we hit go, we output this as that DO-JSON object. This is the piece that Creekside Digital is going to open source later this year. We're going to publish the schema and make it available. We're also going to make available examples of this with accompanying plain English statements of work. And again, the plan is to give all of you at the federal agencies and at these institutions free access to the Composer tool. All you'll have to do is sign up. And you'll be given a login and password. You can log into the tool. You can create your own specifications based on FADG 3, based on M1921, and output your own DO objects and then your accompanying plain English statements of work that will generate the text that you can reuse for operating the project itself or using it to bid out those services, to vend out those services. So, okay, great. We got our specification. And it's defined very, very exhaustively, and it's defined in such a way where it is tightly compliant with with not only FADG, if we want to go that way, but also with the M1921 regulations for permanent records. What do we do with it now? And this is the piece that we're really trying to solve for you agencies that are wondering how in the world you're going to know you got this right. We have a massively scalable engine called Virtuoso. And what Virtuoso does is it takes that spec that we just created in Composer, we take it and we take your completed batches of digitized content and we verify them. We literally verify for every single file in that batch. We'll verify hundreds of different parameters. We'll calculate every single thing that we can that is technically defined under the M1921 regs, and we will give you back an audit report demonstrating compliance, either pass or fail, with all of these assets. We can scale this up massively. It literally is designed to scale linearly just by us throwing more hardware at it. And it will scale to tens of billions of images and beyond. We view this as ultimately the platform that NARA is going to use most likely to verify this type of content, because there's literally no other way to do it. Nobody's going to script a solution, right, for this volume of content. It's just never going to get done. You have to have something that's massively scalable, that allows non-expert users to interface with this type of content and know, hey, I got it right or I didn't. If I got it right, I move on. If there's a big red X somewhere, then I hand this off to my subject matter expert and my vendor and say, remediate this. I'm going to move on with the stuff that passed, right? But it will generate a plain English audit report that goes along with that individual batch of assets with all the supporting technical details that link back to those parameters that are defined in your regulatory compliant requirements, right? So what does this look like? So in this screenshot of Virtuoso, I've just imported a DO-JSON object, and it's reading that JSON file that you saw, and it's saying, okay, well, this spec defines a master file of 400 PPI, TIFF uncompressed, 8-bit color in the Adobe RGB 1998 color space. And then it's got a JPEG 2000 derivative that is compressed at 20:1, all right? And there are additional technical parameters that govern what that JP2 should look like. And then it's defining more derivatives. Look, I've got a thumbnail TIFF that's 150 pixels long on the long side. I've got a derivative PDF that has an OCR layer. It's a single multi-page file, one per folder. And then I've got metadata that's defined comprehensively, right? Here are the same metadata fields that we saw back for the M1921 requirements for permanent recs. These are all should be there, and those are the expected values that we should see, right? I'm even defining some checksumming. I'm going to be using the Library of Congress Baggett packaging format, which has integrated MD5 hashing if I want to use that for my checksums. Remember, M1921 says you have to use checksums. It doesn't define the implementation of how you do that. So something like Baggett is perfectly acceptable. So in this case, we're using the Baggett format that will automatically generate our checksums for us, and we're including some additional bag level metadata, which you can do with the bag format. So all those things are defined in that single portable DO object that I defined with the Composer tool. Now what I do is I take that DO object, I load it up in Virtuoso, we see that here, and I point Virtuoso at a batch of digitized content. This could be tens of thousands of images, and I say go. And this is one more screenshot from the DO object. This is defining what that output should look like, right? So I can define that, again, this is bagged content, so I'm going to have some bag related files, but I'm also going to say, okay, underneath there, I should have my master TIFF named like this, and I should have my GIF, my JPEG 2000, and my multi-page PDF. There's a folder where my target should live, right? So I take that JSON object and I point it at a batch of content and I say go. And the Virtuoso product will massively and in parallel will introspect into every single file that it finds in that batch, and it will conduct a series of automated checks, and it will return to us very, very granular detail about what it finds. Every single one of these parameters is tied back to a part of the M1921 regs for permanent records. By the regulations, you must check and comply with every single one of these technical parameters. If you don't, technically your batch is out of compliance. We're automating the verification of every single one of these pieces of data. We're doing it in a way that non-expert users can now do this, given just the DO object and their batches of content. And they get back a report like this. And in this case, you can see everything, life is good. I got all happy green check boxes everywhere. My metadata is all compliant. Here are all the fields that were checked for. Notice these are for individual TIFFs. I have file 0003.tiff open up. We're checking all these parameters for every single one of them. We're checking targets for every target that's in a batch. We're calling either golden thread or open dice on the back end. We're automatically passing that target image to these tools, getting a pass back for you, and you either pass, fail. If everything passed, we just check it off. If one of the FADGI metrics failed, we will detail that for you on the audit report and tell you how you can remediate them. And other things, here's our master files. We're looking at, is that file well-formed and valid? Is the file size greater than 0? Does it have valid image widths and heights? Are the extensions and resolution parameters all defined properly according to what was defined in that DO object specification, right? We're checking this for every single file. This could be thousands or tens of thousands of files for every single batch. checksums. This one's very obvious, right? One of the very first things we do, M1921 requires that you have a checksum for every single asset. We're recalculating them all and making sure that they're all there. Also making sure that there are no files that are not listed in the manifest. These are just as important. This is what it looks like if something fails. So literally what this tool does is it searches for all the needles in the haystack. You're not going to have a human do this stuff. You'll never get it done. We're talking about doing, over the course of a large project like that copyright project that I told you about, billions and billions and billions of calculations to find this stuff. In this particular instance, it failed this particular TIFF because the unit of measure was set incorrectly. Everything else looks like it was set right, but instead of inches, which is what the DO object said that was supposed to be set for, the unit of measure, we had it set as millimeters and we failed. So what Virtuoso is doing here, and the value that it's doing, it is doing all the technical heavy lifting for non-expert users. It is massively scaling to find all the needles in the haystack and giving us instantly actionable feedback on the compliance of our particular batches of M1921 and FADGI compliant content, right? How does this work in practice for you all that are interested now? Say you're at a federal agency and you're like, man, Jim, that sounds great. How do we do this? So this year, we are looking for beta customers, beta users that are interested in working with us. You don't have to be at a federal agency. If you're at a big university library and you'd like to talk with us about this, or any type of library, and you're working on FADGI compliant projects, 3-star or above, we would love to talk with you. Email me or reach out to me after this presentation. I'll be happy to talk with you about that. But this year in practice, the way that verification will work, send us your batches either on hard drive or put them up on an Amazon S3 bucket or SFTP them over to us. I'm not going to put that in a presentation again because it's too hard to say. We will verify them and we will send you back the audit report. Starting next year and beyond, the web tools will exist to make this 100% self-service. You will be able to create an account with Creekside Digital for Virtuoso. You will be able to point the Virtuoso tool yourself at your own digitized batches of assets, put them on S3 or something like that, and point the Virtuoso tool at them and automatically verify them yourselves and get a pass-fail. Combined with your own ability to work with the Composer tool to refine your own project batches, again, I've said this 3 times, I'm going to say it again because this is really what this is about. This is about taking all of the complexity out of compliance for M1921 for non-expert users and making it a whole lot easier for folks to ensure that their digitization activities are compliant, right? We're going to have multiple options for folks that want to run this on AWS. We know that NAGARA runs on AWS, so that's the no-brainer in the room is to make this entire infrastructure run using Amazon Web Services. That's already underway. We're also going to have on-prem options for somebody like, maybe somebody that's in a defense-facing agency that needs to air-gap this thing and run it on, really, really self-contained hardware. We can absolutely do that. We're already doing it. So that's going to be another deployment option for folks as well. But today, I just wanted to give you a taste of, what's coming down the pike for our solutions for M1921 compliances. Again, this is all this company does. We don't do anything else. We're specialists, and I think you can pick up on some of that by, the depth of the solutions that we're bringing to the market for this particular problem. Reach out to me if you have any questions about the software side. And again, over the next week, if you have questions about the digitization side, the digitization services side, reach out to me as well because Joan's on vacation. That's it. That's all I had planned for today. And I think we're right at time. So I guess I did a pretty good job there. I'd like to open up the floor for questions if anybody has any right now.
Yeah, go ahead and either enter into the chat or you can raise your hand. I'll unmute you and you can ask Jim your question. Jim, will you go back 1 slide to your contact information and leave that up while we do question and answers?
Sure.
That way they'll just have it neatly in sight. Give it a minute here to see. All right, Dan, thanks for raising your hand. You are requested to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question once you've done that.
So you'd mentioned FADGI 3-star. Does this software allow you to go to your own spec, like you customize a spec related to FADGI?
Absolutely. In fact, the two examples that I cited for the U.S. Copyright Office record books, as well as the Law Library Serial set, they start with a base FADGI 3-star spec for those material types, and then they change some of the minimums. For example, the minimum spec for bound books and general bound book collections is a 300 PPI resolution under FADGI 3-star. Library of Congress likes to bump all their direct capture up to 400 PPI whenever they can. So that's an example of one type of modification that you could do to the specs. It will warn you if you're doing something that's not compliant in the Composer application. That's part of the intelligence that it brings to the table.
Stan, for the question. Anything in the chat, but if anyone else has a question, raise your hand. That's nice engagement there. If you're wanting to raise your hand and you don't know how, at the very bottom of your WebEx window, you see a little hand icon. Click that button. It'll signify to me that you want to be unmuted.
If you all would prefer to email me questions after, that's perfectly fine as well.
Great, yeah. And not going to belabor it. No one's putting anything in the chat, and I'm not seeing any other hands raised. So thank you for that option, Jim. And everyone, thank you for attending today. Wait, oh, that's a clap. Okay, thanks, Darren. I saw the claps and I thought it was a hand raise. Thanks, Jim, and thanks everyone for attending the inaugural Sponsor Solution Series presentation. We appreciate you being here. Thanks again so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.